Henry, once a strong and admired man, had lost his way, disconnected from the life he once knew. But through the power of a familiar melody, he found a path back to the moments and people he cherished most. Henry had always been someone people looked up to. He was strong, successful, and well-loved by everyone who knew him. He was the kind of father and husband that his family could always count on. His life was busy, filled with work trips and meetings, but he never let that stop him from making time for the ones he loved most, his wife and daughter. Even when his work took him far away from home, he would always call his family, making sure to hear his daughter's voice before she went to bed. It was during one of these work trips that everything changed. The trip was supposed to be short. Just a few weeks, he had said, kissing his wife and daughter goodbye at the airport. His daughter, who adored him more than anyone, gave him a tight hug and whispered, "Come back soon, Daddy." Henry smiled and promised her that he would. No one knew it would be the last time they saw him as the man they loved. While abroad, he worked as usual. But one day, Henry started feeling strange. It began with small things. He'd forget where he placed his briefcase, or he'd lose track of time during meetings. At first, he didn't think much of it. Everyone gets tired on business trips, right? But the forgetfulness didn't go away. In fact, it started getting worse. Soon, he couldn't remember what hotel he was staying at or what city he was in. He found himself wandering the streets, unsure of where he was going. Something was wrong, but he didn't know what. Henry felt a deep sense of fear creeping in, but he tried to push it aside. "I'll be fine," he kept telling himself. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. One morning, Henry woke up in his hotel room and couldn't remember why he was there. He looked around, trying to recall where he was or how he had gotten there, but nothing came to mind. His heart raced, and he began to panic. He couldn't even remember his own name. Henry, who had always been so sure of himself, so in control of his life, was now a stranger in his own mind. When his coworkers found him wandering the streets, confused and frightened, they knew something was seriously wrong. They rushed him to a hospital, hoping the doctors could help. But after running several tests, the doctors couldn't find anything physically wrong with him. There was no injury, no obvious disease. The only thing they knew was that his memory was disappearing, and they didn't know why. He had contracted a strange illness that was erasing everything that made him who he was. Back home, his wife and daughter were waiting for his return. They had prepared a welcome home celebration for him, excited to hear about his trip and see him after weeks of being apart. But instead of the man they loved walking through the door, they got a phone call that would change their lives forever. Henry doesn't remember anything. The doctor said gently over the phone, "We're doing everything we can, but right now he doesn't recognize anyone, not even himself." His wife dropped the phone, her heart shattering. How could this happen? He had been fine when he left. He had been healthy, strong, full of life. Now, the man she loved, the father of her child, didn't even know who she was. When they finally brought him home, it was as if he had become a completely different person. He looked the same, but his eyes were blank, like a stranger's. His daughter, who had always been so close to him, ran to him with open arms, shouting, "Daddy." But instead of picking her up and hugging her like he always did, he just stood there, confused. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice empty. His daughter stopped in her tracks, her little heart breaking as she realized her father didn't know her anymore. She tried again, tears in her eyes. "It's me, Daddy. It's me." But he just shook his head, looking around the room as if it were the first time he had ever seen it. His wife tried to explain, tried to remind him of their life together, of the love they shared, but none of it worked. No matter how hard they tried, the man they knew and loved was gone, replaced by someone who didn't remember their faces, their names, or their shared moments. The house that had once been filled with laughter and joy now felt empty and cold. His wife and daughter did everything they could to help him, showing him old photographs, playing his favorite music, telling him stories of their life together. But nothing seemed to bring him back. The doctors had no answers. They couldn't explain why this was happening or when, if ever, he would get better. The only thing they could offer was a small glimmer of hope. Sometimes, memories come back when we least expect it, one of the doctors said. It might take time, but there's still a chance. Still, life moved on, even as the man remained lost in his own world. His daughter, though heartbroken, tried to be strong. She continued preparing for her wedding, even though the father who was supposed to walk her down the aisle couldn't even remember who she was. Every day, she prayed for a miracle. Every night, she cried herself to sleep, missing the father she once knew. How would you feel if you were in this situation? If someone you loved, someone so close to you, suddenly forgot everything about you? Would you still hold on to hope, or would you feel like giving up? Tell us how you feel. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Let's continue. Despite his family's best efforts, the Henry's memory never returned. His wife and daughter had done everything they could, showing him photos, telling him stories, and trying to recreate the life he had lost in hopes that something might trigger his memories. But nothing worked. He looked at his wife and daughter with the same blank stare, unable to grasp the deep connection he once had with them. He no longer felt at home in the house he had built for his family. It felt unfamiliar to him, like he was living in a stranger's home. As time passed, the man grew restless. He felt like he didn't belong, even in his own home, so he began to wander. He would leave the house in the early mornings and walk through the town, sometimes for hours, with no real destination. The familiar streets of his neighborhood didn't stir anything in his mind. Henry felt lost, not just in the world around him, but inside himself. He had no sense of where he came from or where he was going. At first, his family tried to bring him back home, hoping that being surrounded by familiar things might help jog his memory. But the man was like a bird that had slipped from its cage. He kept leaving, wandering further each time, until one day, he didn't come back at all. His wife was frantic, searching the streets, calling the police, putting up missing person posters. His daughter cried herself to sleep every night, wondering where her father had gone. They wanted him home, but the man had drifted too far, both physically and mentally. He had become homeless, though he didn't understand what that meant. All he knew was that he didn't recognize the faces that greeted him, and he no longer had the desire to stay in a house that felt foreign. The streets became his new home. During the day, he wandered aimlessly, sometimes stopping in parks where he would sit for hours, watching people pass by. He didn't know who they were or what they were doing, but observing them gave him a strange sense of peace. In these quiet moments, something deep inside him stirred, though he didn't know why. As the days turned into weeks, the Henry found solace in something unexpected: singing. He didn't know where the songs came from. They were buried deep in his mind, like fragments of a past he couldn't remember. He couldn't recall any specific words or melodies, but when he opened his mouth to sing, the music came naturally, as if it had always been there. His voice was strong, clear, and full of emotion, even though his mind was clouded. One day, as he sat on a bench in the park, he began to sing softly to himself. He wasn't even aware that he was doing it at first, but soon, his voice grew louder, filling the air around him. The music seemed to flow through him effortlessly, each note resonating with a deep, hidden emotion. Passers-by stopped in their tracks, captivated by the sound. There was something raw and powerful about his voice, something that drew people in. Before long, a small crowd had gathered around him, curious about the man who sang with such emotion, yet looked so lost. People were mesmerized. His voice, though untrained, was filled with an indescribable sadness and beauty. It was as if each song carried the weight of 1,000 untold stories. His face was expressionless, yet his voice told a tale of heartbreak, loss, and yearning. The listeners were moved. They didn't know the man's story, but they could feel the depth of his soul in every note he sang. Some listeners were moved to tears, touched by the raw emotion in his voice. Others stood in silence, simply listening, not wanting the music to end. Henry didn't ask for money, and he didn't acknowledge the crowd. He just sang, as if the music was the only thing he had left. Word of the man singing spread quickly through the town. Soon, people began visiting the park just to hear him sing. Every day, a small crowd would gather, waiting for him to arrive and fill the air with his haunting melodies. He became a local legend, the homeless man with the unforgettable voice. On cold night, when the crowds had gone home, Henry would sleep on the streets, finding shelter under park benches or in doorways. He was unaware of the family that was still searching for him, desperate to bring him home. To him, the streets were his only home now. He didn't feel the pain of separation because he couldn't remember the people who were waiting for him. All he had was his voice and the brief moments of peace it brought him. Sometimes, as he sang, there would be a flicker of something in his mind, a flash of a memory, a glimpse of a face he couldn't quite place. But the memories never stayed. They were like wisps of smoke, disappearing before he could grab hold of them. The songs were the only thing that made him feel connected to something, though he didn't know what. One evening, as he sang his heart out, a woman approached from the back of the crowd. She watched him for a long time, her eyes filled with tears. It was his wife. She had heard rumors of a homeless man who sang beautifully in the park, and when she arrived, she recognized him instantly, though his clothes were ragged and his face had grown tired. The man didn't notice her at first, too lost in his music. But she stood there, listening, her heart breaking as she realized that while his voice was still strong, his memories were still gone. She wanted to call out to him, to tell him who he was, but something stopped her. In that moment, she understood that he was still lost, still trapped in the fog of his mind. She didn't want to take away the one thing that gave him peace. And so, she listened, along with the rest of the crowd, moved by the music, holding on to the hope that one day, something might bring him back. The man continued to sing, unaware of the love and loss surrounding him, unaware of the family that was still waiting for him to return. As the months slipped by, the daughter's wedding day drew closer. It should have been the happiest time of her life, a time filled with excitement, joy, and the thrill of marrying the man she loved. But for her, the happiness was overshadowed by an overwhelming sorrow, the absence of her father. The man who had been her hero, her confidant, and the one she always turned to for advice, was now lost in a world where he no longer remembered her. Every day as she planned her wedding, she couldn't help but think of the father she had once known. The father who would pick her up and spin her around as a little girl, who would help her with her homework, and who had always been there to support her through every milestone. Now, as she prepared for the biggest day of her life, he wasn't there in the way she needed him most. He didn't even remember her name. She tried to focus on the positive, telling herself that this was her moment, that she was about to marry the love of her life. But every time she looked at her wedding dress or thought about walking down the aisle, her heart ached. The image of her father walking her down the aisle, beaming with pride, was something she had dreamed of since she was a little girl. Now, that dream felt like it was slipping through her fingers. Her fiancé, though understanding and supportive, could only do so much. He would hold her when she cried at night, reassuring her that everything would be okay. But deep down, the pain of knowing her father wouldn't be able to share this special day with her was something only she could feel. It was a grief that sat heavily in her heart, a constant reminder of the man she had lost even though he was still alive. As the wedding day approached, the daughter faced a painful decision. Should she include her father in the wedding, knowing that he might not even recognize her? Would it hurt too much to see him sitting in the audience, confused and detached, when all she wanted was for him to walk her down the aisle with pride? One day, as she sat in her room surrounded by wedding invitations, she couldn't hold back her tears any longer. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing quietly. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Her father was supposed to be the one to give her away, to tell her how proud he was of the woman she had become. Now, he didn't even know who she was. After a long, tearful night, she made the decision to send him an invitation. It was a risk. A part of her feared that he wouldn't come at all, or worse, that he might show up and not even recognize her as his daughter. But deep down, she held onto a sliver of hope. Maybe, just maybe, seeing her in her wedding dress or hearing her voice on that special day would reach him in a way that nothing else had. The days leading up to the wedding were bittersweet. The excitement of marrying the man she loved was mixed with an overwhelming sadness that her father was still lost in his forgotten world. She tried to push through, focusing on the details of the ceremony and reception, but everything felt incomplete without her father by her side. The memory of him singing her lullabies, telling her bedtime stories, and being her rock made her long for the man he used to be. She rehearsed her song over and over again, praying that it would reach him. Singing had always been something she and her father shared. As a child, he would sing to her at night, his deep voice comforting her when she was scared. Those memories were some of her most cherished, and she hoped that the power of her voice might stir something inside him, something that would bring him back to her, even if only for a moment. Finally, the wedding day arrived. The sun shone brightly, and the church was filled with flowers and happy faces. But despite the beauty of the day, her heart was heavy with uncertainty. As she walked down the aisle, her mother by her side, she couldn't help but glance at the back of the church, hoping to see him there. But he was nowhere to be found. The ceremony went on, and though her heart ached, she smiled through her tears, trying to focus on the love she had for the man she was about to marry. But her thoughts kept drifting back to her father. Would he come? Would he remember? And then, just as the time came for her to sing, she saw him. He had quietly slipped into the back of the church, his clothes a bit disheveled, his face tired, but there he was. Her heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, she was unsure whether he even recognized where he was. But he sat there, watching her, his expression blank. Taking a deep breath, she began to sing. Her voice, though shaky at first, grew stronger with each note. It was a song she had chosen carefully, one that held deep meaning for both of them. As her voice filled the church, something inside her father seemed to change. His face, once clouded with confusion, softened. His eyes, which had been distant, focused on her. She sang with everything she had, her voice full of emotion, love, pain, and hope. As she reached the final verse, she saw something she hadn't seen in a long time. Recognition. Her father's eyes filled with tears, and he stood up slowly, as if in a daze, walking toward her. The music, her voice, had broken through the fog in his mind. The guests in the church noticed the change in him. He stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving his daughter. His once clouded expression was now filled with emotion, recognition, love, and pride. He took a few steps forward, his movements hesitant at first, but then with more certainty. The bride saw him approaching, and her heart skipped a beat. She could see it in his eyes. He remembered. As she finished the last note of the song, there was a moment of silence, and then he was standing right in front of her. Tears filled her eyes as she looked at him, the man she had missed so much, the man who had been lost for so long. He reached out and took her hand, and in that instant, she knew her father was back. The wedding, which had once been clouded by sorrow, became a celebration not just of love between husband and wife, but of the powerful bond between a father and his daughter. For the first time in months, she felt whole again. The church erupted in applause, not just for the beautiful song, but for the miracle that had just unfolded before their eyes. Father and daughter embraced, their hearts full of joy. The man who had once been lost had found his way back, guided by the love in his daughter's voice. The wedding reception was in full swing. The room was alive with the hum of conversation, laughter, and the clinking of glasses. Guests chatted happily at their tables, enjoying the celebration and the atmosphere of love in the air. The newlyweds sat at the head of the room, beaming with happiness as they soaked in the warmth of their family and friends. Laughter and applause filled the room as father and daughter danced, and soon, others joined them on the dance floor. The atmosphere was electric, filled with joy and celebration. There was no longer any sadness, only the happiness of the moment. Friends and family surrounded them, clapping, cheering, and celebrating the miracle that had happened. The bride couldn't stop smiling. The day had been perfect in every way, but this reunion with her father was more than she could have ever hoped for. As they danced, she looked up at him and saw the man she had always known, the man who had loved her so deeply. He was back, and it was as if they had never been apart. The family, once torn apart by the pain of lost memories, had come together again. The love that had always been there had triumphed, and the power of family had restored what had been taken away. Have you ever experienced the power of music to unlock memories or stir emotions? What do you think about this story of a father and daughter reconnecting through a song? Let us know how you feel. We'd love to hear your thoughts. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more uplifting and heartwarming stories. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a new post, and share this story with your loved ones to spread the message of love, hope, and the strength of family.